welcome to this new video. I am very happy to welcome you for your weekly feature, which will discuss a current issue, a topic that unfortunately affects more and more of us, as more and more of us are experiencing professional exhaustion, experiencing burnout. For those who know me, I am very happy to see you again. You have seen me many times over many years through Bibuda. I meet you today through Vivo Vojo, this Dynamica program, which aims to provide weekly support. So, the topic that brings us together will be addressed through my expertise, through my perspective as a naturopath, which I have been practicing for over 30 years now, this pedagogical approach that is dear to me in transmission, and also various tools from natural medicine that allow us to truly understand what burnout is, to identify it well, and above all, to offer you solutions to prevent it. Or, if unfortunately you are already on the brink of this professional exhaustion, to see how you can act to help your body create the maximum resources to avoid sinking like the Titanic into what we call burnout. So, for this topic, I propose the following agenda. First of all, it is important to understand, which is the whole purpose of this program, to identify, understand, and recognize what burnout is. We will see that burnout is an exhaustion that is no longer about adaptive stress, no longer about survival stress, but rather a long-term stress that gradually makes us sink. We will start by discussing what professional exhaustion, known as burnout, is, and then we will look at semiology, that is, the signs that allow us to identify it. This is the first part. To quickly get to what you are probably waiting for, I imagine, is what are the suitable solutions to prevent burnout. We will see, faithful to Hippocratic medicine, faithful to traditional medicines, and also to hepatic nature, that the first lever to prevent this professional exhaustion remains nutrition. We will see that nutrition plays an essential role in the health of our cells, but also more specifically that of our neurons, to avoid falling into this exhaustion. We will see that in the field of nutrition, there are what we call in our jargon superfoods, that is, foods with a high micronutrient density and an exceptional concentration of certain components. In particular, I will talk to you about climate, this microalgae from Lake Oregon in the United States, which has properties perfectly suited to counter or survive this situation of exhaustion. I will also talk to you about fresh pollen, which is an extremely rich superfood, adapted with complex sugars, antioxidants, and protectors, to also act in the same direction. The second part, in the hygiene dear to naturopathy, will be all about managing the hygiene of rhythms. And we will see that, precisely, to mitigate this professional exhaustion, changing your pace, shifting gears, taking breathing breaks, and taking breaks in your daily routine is something important. And I will naturally be led to talk about breathing, knowing that these topics are developed by some of my peers and colleagues, but I will provide some practical keys to act at this level. And we will see that relaxation, meditation, and heart coherence are also extremely valuable anti-burnout tools. Finally, I will conclude my presentation with what Mother Nature offers us in her extreme generosity, focusing on plants. We have a family of plants that we call adaptogenic plants, perfectly suited to compensate, support, and strengthen our ability to adapt to this exhausting environment. And I will also conclude as an aromatherapist, some of you know me in this specialty, with 3 essential oils perfectly suited to support once again the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which manages our central nervous system and allows us to adapt to our environment. So, the topic is introduced, and I'm happy to start with you. Let's go, we're off. Stress, initially, is not a disease. We often talk about stress in an exaggerated way, but stress, if we look at the medical definition, is the body's ability to adapt to a change. It can be a change in temperature. If you fall into icy water, stress causes you to develop thermogenesis so you don't die from the cold. You are surprised by a motorist who speeds towards you as you are crossing the road. Stress allows the development of all adaptation capacities at the level of adrenaline and noradrenaline to develop all your abilities to survive, that is to flee or fight, as explained by Henri Labouré. So stress, which we call intense stress, is not something pathogenic. It's quite the opposite. It's survival. So it's an adaptation reaction to flee or fight. That's what you need to remember. Initially, when I am exposed to a sudden change, there is a first stage called the alarm phase. The alarm allows us to mobilize our resources, as I just explained, adrenaline, to increase our blood flow to the muscles, increase respiration and heart rate, always with the survival mindset to flee or fight. But if this stress becomes long-lasting, if this stress settles over time, and although I haven't had the chance to flee or fight the situation, well, I will have to adapt in a sustainable way. And this is what we call the second stage of adaptation, which is the resistance phase. I have to resist pressure at work. I have to resist a hierarchy that pushes me to my limits to achieve the best results without considering my conditions. I have to resist a social situation where stress is constant. Think about this particular period of the health crisis where all of this accumulates and we find ourselves having to adapt in a sustainable way. So here we use other neurotransmitters that allow us to adapt over time, and among others, it is cortisol. Cortisol is a neurotransmitter secreted by the adrenal cortex glands that helps sustain endurance over time. The problem is that this stock is not unlimited. It's like a bank account. You have money in the bank, you spend it, and at some point the account is empty. And when the account is empty, it's called burnout, meaning we have exhausted all our reserves before going through a preliminary phase called burn-in, which means I have burned. But in between, something important happens that you need to identify, and it will help you gain clarity if you have already gone through that period. That is to say, the excess cortisol in the body will compete with two other neurotransmitters. This is what allows us to be energetic, to make plans, and to feel good. The more cortisol I have, the less dopamine I have. This means that I start to lose the ability to be cheerful. I am starting to lose the ability to make plans, to be motivated, and to mobilize my resources in order to fully develop my potential. And the second neurotransmitter with which cortisol will compete is serotonin. This neurotransmitter or neuromediator, which is a synonym, is a symbol of calm, well-being, and a sense of fullness. Well, you understand that when I overconsume cortisol, I am in survival mode and no longer adapting to life. In survival mode, I try to hold on, and gradually the other two enter into competition, exhaust themselves, and at some point everything stops. And that's when we enter what we call burnout. So the question you might legitimately ask is this something important? Does it concern many of us? Well, the answer is yes. If with Vivo Vojo and Dinamica we have chosen this topic together consensually, it is because it affects 7 to 10% of employees. I specifically mention employees or people in positions because we will see that the term burnout in the medical field is simply reserved for the professional world, the working world. So, one can experience burnout for other reasons, such as marital issues and so on. It will be exhaustion, but here we are really going to focus our topic on the environment in relation to the professional environment. How many does that represent? It represents more than 3 million, exactly 3.2 million people, meaning those who are exposed, who are victims, or on the brink. And according to recent statistical studies, they show us that in reality, it is much more than that. According to a study revealed by L'Express in 2014, nearly 4 million people are at high risk. Unfortunately, the number has only worsened since then. Given the particular situation we are going through, so with 4 million people affected by this, I believe that as a health professional focused on preventive medicine, using all the resources that nature offers us, it is worth taking care of it and having the tools and means to avoid becoming part of the statistics. We will start by looking at the etiology of burnout, that is the origin or origins of burnout, so that you understand, and this is important, all the signs that should alert you for yourself or for your loved ones to understand how it happens. So what needs to be clearly understood is that the illness since we are indeed talking about an illness, is triggered by constant and prolonged exposure to stress at work. So, there are important words to identify: constant exposure, because as you understood from my presentation earlier, compared to acute stress, we can adapt in an emergency, we recover our resources, a bit like a rubber band, we stretch it, we don't break it, it returns to its initial position. That's acute stress. But in the case of stress, the one that will lead us to burnout, the stress is constant, meaning we keep stretching, we don't release this rubber band, which is my metaphor, as you understood, for the capacity to adapt, prolonged in a professional environment, since work-related stress is what leads to burnout. So, it is often, statistically, and we have observed it from a clinical point of view, people who are exposed from a professional standpoint to high mental, emotional, and affective demands. Also, people who are exposed to responsibilities, or when the goals expected of them are difficult, or even, so you see there is both this notion of consistency, durability, significant mental load. You have to mobilize all these resources, and well, at some point we exceed our adaptation capacities, and that's where we are precisely in the part of burnout. So what needs to be understood from my presentation is that the people at high risk are those who invest a lot in their work. I usually say, metaphorically and a bit humorously, but at least I'm sure you'll remember it, that those who don't care don't have much chance of experiencing burnout. You will understand that historically, this is why it primarily concerned people who had significant responsibilities, were highly exposed mentally and emotionally, and I am thinking of caregivers. Not necessarily in these past years through the health crisis, but in general. And it's true that when the goal is unattainable, when you work in a healthcare service and there are more patients than your care capacity, well, you already have an extremely favorable environment for leading to burnout. So, these notions of burnout are quite old. They are about 60 years old. But in the 60s, the difference compared to today is that there was no direct correlation between this extreme fatigue at work and scientific studies. For the WHO, the definition of burnout, it explains it as, therefore, the World Health Organization, as an intense feeling of fatigue, loss of control, and inability to achieve concrete results at work. So you see a definition that is not quite identical, but fairly close. What you need to remember about this notion of burnout is that it is a state of professional, emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion. It's not just a notion of fatigue. Someone who does excavation work or significant physical labor would experience physical exhaustion, thus physical fatigue, but there isn't necessarily a correlation with emotional and psychological exhaustion. So it's really these three aspects that are being strained, and at some point the body can no longer cope on all three fronts. It collapses. And the problem is that at some point we observe an inability to recover in short periods, even with rest. This is a warning sign. We will revisit it later, but it is a warning sign, meaning that even if I take a little rest when I am solicited, it is not enough to recover. In other words, my elastic band can no longer return to its initial position. So now we are going to look at the different stages and clearly segment the various signs to identify. So what you need to understand is that it always starts, this is the first thing to know, with an increase in mental load. I have more and more things to think about, things to organize, to reflect on, and to engage in this mental gymnastics. So, it always starts with this increase. It can also be an increase in business trips, an increase in tasks, and it manifests in lifestyle as a reduction in availability. So more responsibilities, less availability, this is the precursor, it's the antechamber of burnout. If we want to identify, to avoid, well, we will move on to the first alarm phase. The first alarm phase will manifest as doubt. That is, someone who used to know how to do their job well. Think about that nurse who knew how to give injections, who knew how to draw blood, etc. Think about that accountant who was capable of completing their financial statements successfully. About that person who was able to perform their tasks perfectly in the company, to organize their days, to plan, to manage. Well, at some point, this work overload causes my reaction and action capacities to decrease. And how does that manifest? Through doubt. So this is something that is extremely important to identify. I am no longer the same. I am no longer the same person. I start to doubt my abilities and say, I don't know if I will make it. Yet something I mastered well, I start to doubt. That is the first warning sign. Through this impression of being overloaded, through this impression of being constantly overwhelmed, through this feeling, doubt will arise about the results to be achieved, which can lead the person, and remember, I said it earlier, it happens to people who are good professionals, who have a professional conscience. They will start to doubt, and they will start to feel guilty, and this can manifest as frustration, as irritability, or simply a drop in morale by saying it's no longer possible. This is the first warning sign. Second warning sign. We arrive, we continue, we haven't taken any measures, and now we start to see a person withdrawing into themselves. The person is no longer the same, they doubt themselves, but at the same time, they are withdrawn. She isolates herself, and that is easily noticeable. Within the family, she is no longer available for her spouse, her children, her relatives, or her friends. She is in doubt, but moreover, she is no longer available, and she finds 1,001 excuses saying, well, it will get better, but she doesn't want to, she can't, forgive me, be available anymore, and she convinces herself that she will manage, that she will regain control at some point. Except that if there is no change, if the workload remains the same, at some point we enter the downward phase, it collapses and it stops. So, the solutions now to prevent burnout. Now that we have set the scene, what it is, how many people it affects, the signs to look out for, who is concerned, we will now see what solutions naturopathy, aromatherapy, phytotherapy, and stress management tools offer. You know that in naturopathy, we have three main pillars to establish health: dietary hygiene, neuropsychic hygiene, and physical activity. And if needed, we will use what we call minor techniques in our jargon, such as plants, possibly energy treatments, essential oils, etc., water, and many other things. So it is through these three main pillars that I will support my presentation to continue. So the first objective in nutrition, the first medicine, as Hippocrates said, let your food be your first remedy. Well, we have both tools that help us preserve ourselves, but also, depending on what we put on the plate, foods that will be less favorable for preventing burnout. So, what you need to remember is that the primary goal of a healthy diet in general, and particularly one adapted to prevent burnout, is to have a diet with high micronutrient density. So, it sounds a bit technical, a bit scientific, let me explain. That is to say, in nutrition, we need both macronutrients with energy value, such as carbohydrates, which belong to the sugar family, lipids, which belong to the fat family, and also proteins to build material at the cellular level, to provide building materials for cells. These are what we call macronutrients that have energy values. But in order to use and make all the mechanics at the cellular level work, which we call biochemistry, we also need micronutrients, that is, all the little workers, the little hands, and this is far from being pejorative in my words, which will be used to burn sugar, to store fat or burn fat, or to build cells. These micronutrients have no energy value, and unfortunately, they have been increasingly neglected in our modern diet, which is called the Western diet. I talk about vitamins, I talk about minerals, I talk about trace elements, but I also talk about fibers, I also talk about enzymes. All these factories are called micronutrients. And much like an athlete who consumes much more energy to perform their sports task, you need to bring in fuel, but you also need to bring in the tools to be able to use the fuels, and these are the micronutrients. We will see that in the family of micronutrients, some are essential, meaning that the body is not able to produce them, and others are indispensable to counteract professional exhaustion, such as burnout. So these micronutrients, these Grapolian saturated acids, we will develop this in a few moments, particularly EPA-DHA. This family of long-chain omega-3 acids are the necessary fuels to make our neurons function? Well, to keep the factory running at full capacity, what you need to take away from my presentation is that we need to increase the micronutritional density of our diet. So, you might ask me, okay, but what is a diet with high micronutrient density? You know, perhaps those who have been following me for a while will remember a rule that I did not invent, but borrowed from my friend Christian Kalscheller, a Swiss doctor very invested in natural medicines, who found a formula that I find very relevant to remember what constitutes healthy eating. I translate it into my own language as what constitutes a diet with high micronutrient density to generally prevent health issues, and here we are talking about mental health in particular. Well, it is the rule of the 3 V's. V for vegetable. The more you increase your intake of vegetables through vegetables, fruits and grains, provided they are not refined, so whole or at least semi-whole. This applies to bread, rice, etc. The more you increase your plant-based diet through oil seeds, that is, seeds that provide fats, such as walnuts, hazelnuts, almonds, sesame, olives, avocados, so all that family, the more you increase your plant-based diet through sea vegetables, which are marine algae, and, well, we are not talking about microalgae, we will not talk about them, well, the more you will increase your intake of minerals, calcium, potassium, magnesium, zinc, iron. The more you increase the plant-based diet, the more you will also increase trace elements and everything the body needs in general, and neurons in particular, to prevent burnout. Second key. So the first key, plant-based, the first V. Second key, V for varied. So it's really varied in terms of colors, varied through seasonal plants. So it is extremely important to have locally sourced vegetables of different colors. We eat bell peppers in the summer. We don't eat tomatoes in January, for example. Why? Because to have antioxidants, which are a particular family of micronutrients that protect our cells in general and our neurons in particular, these foods need to have been exposed to the sun. And this is where they make their own sun protection. That is to say, through photosynthesis, they absolutely need light to feed themselves, to produce energy, and to create organic matter. But behind it, there are certain frequencies that disturb them, which are toxic. So they created filters, and these filters are reflected in plants, fruits, and vegetables by different colors. These colors each represent a particular family of antioxidants. The more you vary your plant-based foods, the more you build up your reserves of antioxidants. You don't need to be a nutritionist or a naturopath to know the amounts of polyphenols, lutein, etc. You just need to follow this rule of varied plant-based foods. And the third rule, which is just as important, the third V, is V for vivant. We are not made to eat only cooked foods, and certainly not made to eat processed foods, and even less ultra-processed foods. So your food intake, your balance, if we want to use that term, which I don't really like because it's quite marketed, in any case, this diet oriented towards your health must also include living foods, that is to say, raw vegetables, freshly made vegetable juices, herbs that have not been cooked or processed, and you will see that in my selection of superfoods, I have chosen one in particular that is the very expression of living food. So 3V, vegetable, varied, and living is the best guarantee for having a healthy diet in general and a shield diet against this disease called burnout in general. To increase the micronutrient density for our neurons, we will need to add a few specific ones, so I will give you a list that is not exhaustive, but will still give you an idea of what we are talking about. We talk about magnesium, we talk about iron, we talk about B vitamins, which are essential for our neurons to function, B5, B6, B9, B12. We also talk about protecting our neurons through polyphenols, antioxidants, and omega-3s, which are fundamental. It's not only in plants, you can find it in algae, which is the food of fish, but they also synthesize these long-chain omega-3s, EPA and DHA. For people who are not vegan or vegetarian, it is also relevant to eat small fatty fish to get the right fuel for the neurons. And for those who do not eat fish, rest assured there are still solutions that I will talk about later. So the first essential and important micronutrient for the nervous system in general is magnesium. And contrary to popular belief, actually, the best way to absorb magnesium is through food. Faithful to the Hippocratic principle, let your food be your first medicine, well, we will first look into nutrition. And if that is not enough, only then it is always possible to seek what we call dietary supplements or nutritional supplements found in pharmacies, organic stores, etc. So, when you take magnesium from food, the advantage is that it is in the right dosage, it has the right availability or even the right bioavailability, it's the best. And well, where do you find magnesium? You will find it in cashew nuts. Cashew nuts are one of the richest sources of magnesium. In sunflower seeds, which are even a bit more concentrated than cashews, in sesame seeds, in almond seeds, and for the food lovers listening to me, it's not in chocolate that you'll find it. You can eat chocolate, but it has some drawbacks, especially in excess, as it is in cocoa beans. Yes, chocolate is rich in magnesium, but that's because it is made from cocoa beans. However, sugar and fatty acids are added, and that is less beneficial for our neuronal health. So it's better to go sourcing at the origin, and the origin is the cocoa bean. And if you manage to find them, raw cacao beans are becoming increasingly easier to find. You can snack on a few beans throughout the day, and you will get your dose of magnesium for your nervous system's needs. Another alternative, so we have seen seeds, we also have grains provided they are not refined. So white rice, white bread, white pasta, Vorzik, it's not good. When you remove the fibers, you also remove the minerals. So you need to look for whole products. Or if you are not used to eating whole foods, start with an intermediate step called semi-whole. Cereals are also extremely interesting because beyond the minerals we just mentioned in unrefined or lightly refined cereals, we also find the famous group of B vitamins, essential for the energy functioning of our cells, but essential for our neurons, the famous B3, B6, B9, B12 that I mentioned earlier in whole grain cereals. B vitamins are also found in animal products. So if you eat animal products, prioritize fish, or if not, poultry and even eggs. These represent the animal proteins that are most suited to our physiology, and especially those that will produce the least waste. For B12, it is found in animal products, and if you want to simply reduce your diet to an ovo-vegetarian regime, eggs are more than sufficient to provide B vitamins in general, and B12 in particular, which is found almost exclusively in animal proteins with few exceptions. Antioxidants, good news, are also found in plants. You understand the first V, vegetal, because as soon as you consume plants, fruits, and colorful vegetables, you get antioxidants, provided they have ripened outside and not in greenhouses and have been nourished with nutrient-rich liquids that have never seen the soil. So, fruits cooked at maturity, vegetables cooked at maturity that have been exposed to the sun ensure a great richness in antioxidants. And finally, EPA, DHA, these long-chain omega-3 fatty acids are found in this assimilable form and without risk of deficiency in fatty fish. If you do not eat fatty fish, you can always supplement with fish oils as a dietary supplement. Alternatively, for vegans, there are also options to take EPA and DHA through algae-based supplements such as After discussing nutrition, we will talk about specific foods known as superfoods, which are characterized by their high micronutrient density, which is of interest to us in preventing burnout, or also specific compounds that have a very marked effect on our nerve cells, namely our neurons. The first superfood I propose to you, which far surpasses all others in terms of the needs we are interested in, is this freshwater microalga called clamet. You can find it under another name, AIFA, which is an acronym whose terms I will spare you. It is a cyanobacterium, which means an association of pigments with wild bacteria. And that's important to know. Maybe you are familiar with spirulina, but spirulina is cultivated. Here we are really talking about wild microalgae, which only grow in one place on the globe, in the state of Oregon, on a lake called Lake Plamat, precisely at a high altitude of 1,300 meters in a protected area. So I am giving you all these details because there are indeed many companies that are not necessarily very ethical and tend to mix things up a bit. So, as part of a bonus, I will talk to you about qualitative choices to ensure you buy the right climate and probably even provide links to source the right product. We will review this in our bonuses. So this microalgae has the particularity of growing in a very healthy, very specific environment, which means it will concentrate a certain number of micronutrients that interest us. For our health in general and that of our neurons in particular, the first micronutrient that interests us is phycocyanins, which is the pigment that gives this microalgae its bluish color, more blue than green, unlike spirulina, which represents 5 to 12% of the content of this microalgae clamate and is a super protector at the neuron level. It is indeed one of the very best protective shields we can absorb in our diet. There are also other antioxidants such as lutein and zeaxanthin, which are very interesting pigments for another part of our brain, the eyes, since the eyes are a continuation of the brain. These are protective pigments for vision, lycopene, which is also found in other foods. So all of this belongs to the family of protectors. And then there are also some polyphenols that play a detoxifying role for us. This is the bonus. It's not necessarily what we're looking for in this approach, but it doesn't hurt because we'll see that when we get exhausted, we have a lot of waste. And having compounds that help us eliminate this waste a bit better is an added bonus. I've saved the best for last. The unique characteristic, and this is something unique in living organisms in terms of nutrition, is the high concentration of phenylethylamine. Phenylethylamine, which is a naturally occurring compound, is found at approximately 1 to 2% in acclimate. You probably don't know, except for the specialists who are listening to us, this phenylalanine, which is also called PER. It's its acronym, its shortened name. You have certainly already tasted phenylethylamine through another food called chocolate. And when, ladies and gentlemen, you eat chocolate, you say it boosts my biomorale, and you highlight the fact that it contains magnesium, which it does, as we saw earlier, mainly from the cocoa bean. But the real reason is that in cocoa or in chocolate, we find this phenylethylamine, which is a great booster for our neurons. The good news is that there are 5 to 10 times more in clamate than in chocolate. So there's no need to overindulge in chocolate to feel good. You just need to take clamate. I will give you the dosages later. Additionally, it is naturally rich in vitamin B12, which is a bonus for the vegetarians or vegans listening to us. So phenylethylamine is something unique that will help increase transmission between neurons, which will work better for people with a high mental load who are exhausted. It feels good, but at the same time it brings that sensation of pleasure that you might know from chocolate, and I am a chocolate lover, so I speak from experience. This notion of pleasure at the neuronal connection level is a way, through these euphoric molecules, to counteract the malaise that gradually sets in with burnout, in addition to increasing cognition, neuronal plasticity, and neuronal transmission. So it fights against malaise, it fights against exhaustion, it feels good, and this family, the same phenylethylamine as amphetamines, but without the side effects and undesirable effects. So it stimulates the brain, it stimulates libido, it stimulates mood, it stimulates concentration, while limiting the risks of depression, because we will see that with burnout, at a certain point, there are two possible paths if we don't stop. If we don't change the situation, it's either burnout or depression. We are at that crossroads. Well, in both cases, the good news is that indeed the climate has a protective and optimizing role. The second superfood that I have selected for you, especially in this capsule, to prevent the risks of burnout, is fresh pollen. I specifically mention fresh because we will see that there is a difference between flower pollen that you can find in glass jars, which is dry, and fresh pollen, which is collected by the beekeeper at the time of pollination, when the bees are in the phase of collecting pollen, which we call pollination. When it is freshly harvested at that moment, just frozen by removing the oxygen, because otherwise that's the big problem. If the pollen is left exposed to oxygen, it will lose a large part of its protective properties. In another segment, I will also provide you with information on how to find and source pollen under good conditions to ensure the required quality. This fresh pollen, which is the male seed of the flower, has exceptional characteristics as a protective agent. You may not know this, but to be able to support what will carry the pollen, that is to fly on the bee's pollen basket or on its back at a speed of 60 kilometers per hour. Fully exposed to wind, light and UV rays, exceptional protective measures are needed to still arrive in good condition to fertilize the plant's pistil and subsequently contribute to pollination. These male substances are extremely well armed in terms of protection, which we call antioxidants. So fresh pollen is a super antioxidant shield. It's like eating the equivalent of 2 to 3 plates of vegetables and fruits combined through a tablespoon of pollen. So we have all of this in a small concentration, which is why we indeed call it a superfood. In addition to its protective elements like carotenoids, it contains vitamin E, polyphenols, flavonoids, including rutin, and also, which is quite interesting, complex sugars that are easily assimilable. This helps avoid snacking and seeking out stimulating foods or foods that can act as doping agents, such as highly sugary or stimulating foods like caffeine. We have a very interesting natural energy supply that allows the body, and particularly the neurons, to protect and rejuvenate themselves. We have just seen the usable tools derived from natural medicines and nature in part, particularly the appropriate diet, the diet with high micronutrient density. We have just seen the choice of 2 superfoods, clamets and fresh pollen, to bring in protectors and make our neurons function better. And now, we will look more at the psychological aspect. In the psychological aspect, an important point is respecting the hygiene of rhythms. The problem in the situation that leads to burnout is that we are constantly pressing the accelerator, overworked, with no brakes. At some point, much like a car running with the pedal to the metal, the engine heats up until it seizes. The first shield, the first thing to put in place is to take breaks. What we call in our naturopath jargon, the hygiene of rhythms. You might say, generally, the person facing this situation has a significant mental load. They are asked to produce more and more, but I have a solution to propose to you, which is that at some point you need to take stock, and if you are going too far, into exhaustion. At some point, the time you didn't take to avoid it will be lost anyway, and 100 times more. So breaks, you can take them through what we call breathing breaks. We will see an example shortly. You can also simply take a 5-minute break by listening to music that helps you relax. It can be a break with your eyes closed, just 2-3 minutes. It simply means no longer being in orthosympathetic atonia, that is, with your foot on the pedal, to allow the autonomic nervous system, which runs the machine automatically, to slow down and counterbalance that rhythm. It can be a short 5-minute walk, but what you must do in any case is not bring these problems into the break. If you take a mini nap, you close your eyes and simply let things happen without dwelling on problems. If you take a mindful walk, being aware that you are walking in contact with nature or even simply in an urban environment, it is just about not disengaging from this notion of over-solicitation. So, the break, if you have the possibility to make a choice, would be to use as a tool both what will bring a rebalancing of the nervous system and at the same time a break. These are breathing techniques that are really fundamental, because the only way to access our recovery system, which we call the parasympathetic, the one that counterbalances the pedal to the metal, is through breathing. The breathing technique that seems easy for me to explain, pedagogically very accessible for everyone, without attending long seminars on the subject, some will offer you that and it's great, but here we will keep it simple with basic things, is what we call square breathing. Square breathing It is simple to understand. Imagine that you have a square. There are 4 sides. That's how we define it. So there is a first side where I will inhale, a second side where I will hold my breath, an apnea, a third side where I exhale, and a fourth side where I hold my breath again. Doing 2 to 3 minutes of box breathing regularly is the most effective breathing technique to harmonize the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. You drink a glass of water, you do 3 square breaths. You go to the bathroom, you do 3 square breaths. What will pay off is not doing long sessions, but the repetition with the highest frequencies. It is better to do 1 minute 10 times a day than 10 minutes once, in other words. So, this is an extremely important and interesting key that will affect both the neuropsychic pillar through breathing, and you will also rebalance the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. So, this is a breathing technique that, all in all, is quite simple. But it's true that having a little guide behind you, a small tool that allows you to follow the different steps, as we do in cardiac coherence, which we will talk about in a moment, is something extremely interesting. So, don't hesitate to check out your subscriber area in the practical tools section on relaxation, these breathing tools, and you will see that Vivo Vojo has developed a tool, a small software that allows you to see this breathing from different times. You can configure it, and it's a tool that will accompany you, allowing you to be both playful and practical. Another tool that will interest us, still in the same logic of rebalancing the nervous system and avoiding overheating the mechanism, is everything related to relaxation, mindfulness meditation, and cardiac coherence. Well, cardiac coherence is something that is quite simple to implement, which fits a bit into what I just explained earlier, but with a particular rhythm, where this time there are no breathing pauses. Instead, we aim to have a breathing pattern that coordinates both the cardiac and cerebral dimensions. It is something that should be practiced 3 times a day at a rate of 6 breaths per minute and 5 minutes per session. So, it's a mnemonic device to remember. 365, like the number of days in a year. So, morning, noon, and evening. You need to take 5 minutes out of your day, which makes 15 minutes in total. It's important time. It's not a waste of time because it allows you to stay active and avoid sinking with a frequency of 6 breaths per minute. Inhale for 5 counts, exhale for 5 counts. That makes 10 seconds, and we repeat this 6 times a day. As always, you will be able to find this tool in your subscriber area under relaxation. So leave your joys, develop a tool that allows you to follow the rhythm I just explained to you. That is 6 breaths per minute with 5 seconds of inhalation and 5 seconds of exhalation. But for the more experienced, the more trained, if you have good respiratory capacities, you can then practice on 6-6 or even 7-7, so adjustments are possible. Personally, I advise you to start with 5-5 and then when you are comfortable to increase. The longer the periods we have, the more we seek amplitude and the more we allow for the adjustment of this flexibility at the heart level, which precisely helps to avoid shock and to have a better capacity to adapt to one's environment. It is a relaxation tool, a recovery tool, but it is also an extremely valuable tool to precisely avoid all cardiovascular traumas. It is a true tool for protecting both the nervous system and the cardiac system. We will continue our journey through the tools. You see, there are many, where I will talk to you about fasting. As a specialist in the subject, having written 2 reference books in the field and with extensive experience, I will explain that fasting is an interesting tool, but there are several forms of fasting, and not all forms of fasting are suitable for the prevention of burnout. So, it's important to know that even when you are passionate about a subject, you adjust it and need to tailor it. So the fasting that poses no problem, which rather has advantages without drawbacks for the person who wants to prevent professional exhaustion, would be sequential fasting for me. Why sequential fasting? Because there is no sudden shock to the body, which interests us in another context to develop our adaptive capacities. But in fact, it allows for a 16-hour anabolic feeding pause between 2 days. Basically, what is 16 hours? My night, schematically, lasted 8 hours. You just need to have 4 hours before, 4 hours after, 8 hours before, 8 hours after. You see that you need to surround that night with 8 other hours during which you don't eat, drink plenty. You can even have infusions. You can even have green tea or a light coffee, as long as there is no sugar in it, no fuel in it. In fact, What is the purpose of this phase of sequential fasting? Well, it allows for the creation of a metabolic rest that helps to eliminate better and regulate better. And in the case of burnout prevention, it has a double benefit. As I mentioned earlier, we create a lot of waste when we are experiencing burnout. When we overconsume our micronutrients, we then need to eliminate the waste. As a result, allowing 16 hours instead of 8 or 12 hours, as most of us do, helps better regulate toxins. But it also gives a bit more time to breathe and allows the opportunity to repair micro damage at the cellular level, at the level of neurons, but also on other cells that are exposed to this stress. And stress leads to oxidative stress, which in turn creates damage at the cellular level. The interest of sequential fasting is also to lower insulin, this hormone that is used as soon as I eat carbohydrates or proteins, and by not producing it anymore, it will allow the body to produce more growth hormones, this hormone that allows a child to grow until adulthood, but which is useful in adults to protect their muscles and also repair cells. So this is something interesting. You can implement it. Once you already have the experience, you can go ahead confidently. And if you have never practiced sequential fasting, I advise you to start with 1 day per week. Once you are accustomed to it, you can move to 2 days, doing things gradually, not 2 consecutive days, and see how you function. The 7th tool I propose to help you act, prevent burnout, and protect the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which means the entire axis from the central nervous system to the one that controls the adrenal glands, is going to be phytotherapy to support this effect. In phytotherapy, we have particular plants called adaptogens because they have been able to adapt to specific circumstances, such as significant climatic variations and high light exposure. We can say they have adaptive molecules to survive. And those that have been selected by nature, or those that have managed to survive these particular conditions, well, when we absorb them in the form of an infusion, or in any case, personally, I prefer, as a naturopath and specialist in the world of plants, to rather seek fluid extracts, concentrated extracts. Once again, I will give you the right addresses, the right links in the bonuses. You can find that in our subscriber area. Well, these extraction methods in the service of phytotherapy provide extremely interesting plants in supporting the person in exhaustion to protect them and prevent them from sinking. The first plant I have selected, which is by far the most interesting and the most suitable, I prescribe and recommend very regularly with great effectiveness, and I have had the opportunity to use it myself during an intense work phase, is Rhodiola rosea. Rhodiola rosea is the queen of adaptogenic plants with numerous virtues. It is anxiolytic, as we saw earlier, for someone in exhaustion who starts to feel really unwell, experiencing anxiety and doubt. It is also antidepressant, thus preventing the descent into the depression crossroads I mentioned to you earlier. It improves physical capacities and enhances intellectual abilities. So here is the first one to take, Rhodiola rosea, or simply rhodiola, which is a very interesting herb. The second plant that interests us in this axis of prevention at the corticoadrenal level is Panax ginseng, more commonly known as ginseng, which has a very specific role as a protector at the adrenal glands level, that is, those above the kidneys. It has a role in modulating the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, so it will modulate and prevent everything from deteriorating. It is anti-asthenic, meaning it helps fight fatigue, and it is a great alternative to stimulants. Remember what we said earlier, that people who are exhausted try to stimulate themselves, to deceive themselves, so to speak, with caffeine, sugar, or even other substances, including alcohol. Ginseng helps avoid resorting to these poisons when consumed excessively. It is an intellectual and physical stimulant, an anxiolytic, and an analgesic, which helps reduce the sensation of pain and discomfort. It is also a regulator of the glycemic axis, helping to counteract excess cortisol, which can lead to abdominal fat in people exposed to constant stress. Here are the two plants at the level of specific plants in relation to the choice of adaptogenic plants. The final part, the supportive essential oils that will act as hosts and are comprehensive. You can very well take the two plants I mentioned earlier together, and you can also add the essential oils. In fact, we are going to add as many protectors as possible. So the essential oils will be, I have selected them to protect your adrenal glands, those two glands above the kidneys that produce the cortisol we talked about earlier. So here there are two, once again, quite relevant and interesting. Black spruce and Scots pine, Picea mariana, and Pinus sylvestris, if you are somewhat familiar with Latin and the use of plants in the vernacular language. These two plants have the characteristic of being cortisone-like, meaning they allow you to do the same things that cortisol does, or in other words, to avoid depleting your energy reserves. So here, as we use them, we will put 3 to 4 drops of each, either pure or diluted. If you use them regularly, we will rather dilute them with a little bit of vegetable oil to avoid irritating the skin. We do this after the morning shower to boost the adrenal glands. Along the adrenal glands, 3-4 drops, and you will see that there is an immediate effect where you feel the energy rising, and it helps avoid loading up on caffeine. And once again, this is not a passport to continue exhausting yourself. It is just to avoid crashing and becoming part of the statistics of the 4 million people exposed to burnout. The third essential oil that interests us, which does not act in the same way as the previous two, that is, at the level of corticoadrenal functions, but rather acts more on the psychic level, is a molecular compound called linalool, which is an alcohol found in some essential oils, such as rosewood, thymol, and many others. But the two main ones are these, or rosewood. The interest of linalool, which we will use this time, not as an ointment on the adrenal glands, but through olfaction, is to regain a taste for life. Linalool has the characteristic of boosting morale and bringing goodness back to the heart. Erreur d'analyse XML, mal formée en placement, https, jessapp, agent.com, vidéo, translation, proofread, et 6B8720-255-373-FB, 73209B, numéro de ligne 1, colonne 205. There you go, you have everything. You have all the tools in hand, now it's up to you to use them appropriately. That's why we follow you, that's why I will be pleased to meet you for the Q&A session, because I imagine it's dense, there is a lot of information, but maybe you will need clarifications, adjustments, so I will be very happy to meet you to answer all your questions. See you soon for your full body and mind health.